Good morning and good afternoon based on where you are at your local time. Um, I am Sanjay Mohanty. I'm an assistant professor at UCLA, which is University of California, Los Angeles. And it's a pleasure really to be here and be invited to give these presentations. And before I begin, I really like to thank Dr. Song Hee Jo for these invitations and for coordinating with all of us to come up with these amazing symposiums. There are great talks. I see the programs. It's really, it's my honor to be here. So my topic is stormwater treatment systems, whether it's a long-term source or a sink for microplastics. That's the questions that we ask, and this talk is going to shed some lights on this particular topic. And before I present all the materials, I like to acknowledge that this work is done by partly by two PhD students, Vera Kotnik and Jamie Leonard. Vera did most of the work on stormwater related, and Jamie has worked mostly on the air transport as well as the detection of microplastics. And this is my group, at least part of the group, and many of the undergrad students do contribute this work. So my lab is mostly works on subsurface engineering and analysis. So when I say subsurface, it's basically the 1 feet soil layer or few feet of soil layer beneath our feet, where we engineer them for different purpose. That can be engineered for treatment of stormwater, which is one of the focus here. They can be also engineered to make the crop more resilient for climate change. They can be also engineered to increase biodegradation so that it can clean up contaminated site, or also it can be engineered for different applications. So you work on all the aspect of it, mostly patent transport of pollutants. And this particular case, microplastic is one of the pollutants that we focus on. So, there are many talks you heard about microplastic a lot already. I just want to mention that microplastics are everywhere. And it's not surprising because we have been using plastic products for last 60 to 80 years extensively. And last 20, 30 years, the single-use plastic products has skyrocketed. So that means we are using these disposable plastics and then dumping them in the environment. So they have to be there. And so it's no surprising that we find that in many places. And partly because plastics are not biodegradable. So that's once if they are produced and released into environment, they are expected to last there for hundreds of years. So now there are many different ways these plastics move around in terrestrial environment, and stormwater is one of the major pathways. And the reason is, the moment we dump any plastics on the land, the stormwaters or rainwaters is going to wash them off and release them into oceans. And that's the end products or the end place where they are ended up. But in between, they go through these terrestrial environments where they accumulate in one place, where they release into another place. So stormwater is one of the main driver. And to just account for how much microplastic is moved around in stormwater, we did a literature review and do the analysis in these particular review papers done by the PhD students, Vera. As you can see in the very top two data points are related to glacier, snow, and stormwaters. And so they have the highest concentration of microplastic found in water. So that's not very surprising that we have lots of microplastic in stormwater, because that's the main things that move plastics around. But what is surprising is that glaciers and snow also have equivalent or higher concentrations. That means the air is also another one of the major transport pathways. And then another review paper where it's more like analysis. What we did is that we account for how much microplastics are released into environment because of wastewater treatment plant. So it's kind of irony is that wastewater treatment plants are designed to remove contaminants away from wastewater. And in this case, particularly, all the microplastics, or 90% or more microplastics, are removed by wastewater treatment plants, and then they concentrate in the sludge. And it turns out 51% of that sludge is applied as a fertilizer on lands. And so those fertilizer turns up trillions of microplastics, and they are released. The moment you apply them, these plastics will stay there, and then it releases into environment by runoff. So that's another pathways for plastics to release back into environments from using via the stormwaters. And so that means, what it indicates, that stormwater has so much plastics or microplastics, and they are going to move around unless we treat them or remove them from stormwater. It turns out the stormwater treatment systems or stormwater control measures are designed to remove pollutants like plastics. So it's no surprising when we did the analysis in this graph that you see on the right side. If you take soil samples in urban areas or any urban stormwater treatment systems, they have the highest concentration of plastics, and which is much more than any other locations, any other sediments and soils. So it means that these systems are really doing a good work in removing plastics. But that beg these questions: how long they will continue to remove, and at what point the concentration of plastics that in stormwater that release from these systems would increase, because as you know, that plastics are not going to degrade within next 100 years, or at least so. That means eventually they will accumulate in this place, and they may solve and they become these systems may serve as a source or as opposed to sink. So that's the question we asked, and there are a couple of other questions we asked. First is, now how much plastics is going to expect to be accumulate in these systems? And to answer that question, we got to know the pathways. Are they coming all from via stormwaters, or are they coming? Some of them are coming via air or wind. So most of the stormwater treatment system assume that they are coming via stormwater. So you wanted to ask that question: is this true or not? And then second, one of the biggest factors these systems are designed is to increase groundwater infiltration, so that there's less flooding on the overland flow, and also more drinking water. So these systems are typically designed putting sand or sandy soils here, so that it allow infiltration to occur, or rapid infiltrations. So that means there is a chance that this plastic could move downward much faster. So we asked this question: what's the likelihood of this accumulated plastics to move downwards and contaminate groundwaters? So these are the two critical questions that we hope to have the answer by end of this talk. So the objective was to evaluate the source pathways of accumulated microplastic in stormwater control measures. Most importantly, to understand whether this accumulated microplastic is going to end up in groundwater or not. So these are the two question marks, as you see on the right side. Is this accumulation by winds versus stormwater? And the second is, how much of those accumulated plastics are moving downward? So to answer this question, obviously we can answer that question using a control laboratory studies, but that will not simulate all kind of complexity that you expect in nature. So what we did is we collected soil samples at different depth at many different stormwater treatment systems or stormwater control measures in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles is, as you see in the United States, at the southern west side of the state of California. We have Los Angeles. That's one of the mega city with 10 million people over there. So UCLA is, as you can see, there are many dots over here, and Beverly Hills is maybe something many of you probably heard about it, because that's related to Hollywood, where all the movies and stars lives. And so right near Beverly Hill is the UCLA campus. It's a pretty expensive place to live, but it's a beautiful campus. So that's the place where we work, and we drive around, particularly my students, they drove around different locations and collected soil samples from different stormwater control measures to give an indication of different locations. So as you see, these locations are color coded based on what type of areas: commercial, highways, natural or non-developed lands, parking lots, residential. So as you can see, we have a distribution of some of those in these locations. So as you can see that the stormwater treatment system looks very different at different locations. So this is how it looks. And as you can see, many spots, you can see the big plastic. This kind of basically a trash collection systems. So if any litters that dumped there, it's going to accumulate there because stormwater drive that positions. So there is a hydrological boundary in the sense that where the stormwater goes is defined the boundary. So anything beyond that boundary means stormwater is not going to reach there. So we collected samples, 3 to 5 samples for each stormwater control measures, and a different spot as you see on the very right side. And also we collected 2 different depths. At least 2 different depths. One is the surface sample, which is 0 to 2 centimeters. Another is the subsurface sample, which is the 8 to 10 centimeter, which will give an indication of how quickly the microplastic concentration changes as you increase the depth. So on the left side, that's Vera collecting samples. She has this hand auger. You can see that collect samples up to a depth of 25 centimeters or 10 centimeters. And then on the right side, that's a little bit bigger auger, plate auger, hand augers to collect soil samples. That's Joel's, that's undergrad students. And then we collected those samples and dig out some of them using a pre-washed iron or the stainless steel spatula, so that there is no cross contaminations. And we put them in a aluminum foil, as you see over here on the right at the center. And then once we wrap it up, we put them in the Ziploc bag so that they are not cross contaminated. So we bring them to the lab, and then we process them. But at one spot, we collected samples at many different depths at 2.5 centimeter increments. The reason we do that, we wanted to see the depth profile, to see how quickly the concentration changes, so that we can fit to the exponential model like you see over here. So we expect that the concentration will decrease with depth, and it will decrease exponentially. So if that's the case, then you can feed this curve to get the retardation, which is K, how quick, and that K determines how quickly the concentration decrease. If the K is higher, that means more retardations, if K or less transport. If K is small, that means if plastics are moving faster. So we collected the soil samples, and then we go through a series of processing to before we identify. So first is isolation of plastics, where we use a density separation method, which is essentially mixing some amount of the soils in a potassium iodide solution, which has density around 1.5. And the salt solution. So that means any plastic which is lighter than 1.5 density is going to float, which is essentially all plastics. And not just plastic will float, also the other organic debris. But that will settle basically all soils. So that's what we did. We mixed them in Ki solutions and centrifuge them so that all the soil particles will be settled at the bottom. And anything floats are plastics and organic debris. Then we filter them out, the supernatant, and that will have plastics, some other materials. We add a Nile red dyes, which is preferentially color the microplastics. And it colors everything, but on UV light, under UV lights, the plastic will glow. So that way we can distinguish plastic particles from non-plastic particles, which are equally lighter. But then we use a laboratory developed methods, smartphone. We use a smartphone to count microplastics, which is much faster than using a microscope. So this is a very that's a separate stories how we developed. That's another publications that lead by Jamie. Um, so as you can see over here, that basically is a cell phone, and the center on the top center, that's a cell phone, and cell phone has attachment which has basically it has an attachment that has a magnified lens, external lens, and then there is a place for filter holders, and which will be illuminated by the LED lights, where we can change the wavelength or the things that we need to expose to plastic. So the idea here is that it will you put the filter papers over there, dyed filter papers, and then we take a pictures. And that cell phone itself doesn't have high resolution, so we had that extra lens that makes the resolution much stronger. Based on the field of view, the resolution can be as small as 1 micron. That means we'll be able to distinguish bacterial size particles or 1 micron particles. But in this case, our depth of field is a 25 millimeter, which is or the field of view, which is the filter size, as you can see on the right side. For that wider view, we lose some resolution. So that means we can detect particle or quantify particles as small as 10 micron. So what we detect here is any microplastic above 10 microns, not anything smaller than micron. So this is just to show that the calibration curve that is within these concentrations, we have a linear range. So if our microplastic concentration is higher than that, we dilute the systems to get the accurate concentrations. So now that method, the first results is the question about what's the pathway. So what we see over here is that concentration inside versus outside. So the blue color or the green color is the concentration of microplastic inside the boundary for stormwater treatment system, and the orange color or the yellowish color is outside the SEM. So if you take the surface sample, which is 0 to 2 centimeter, as you can see here, there is no difference in concentration of microplastic inside versus outside of the boundary. And the same thing is true even you go a little deeper. What it means that we expect that if stormwater is the main source of microplastic, that microplastic that accumulate in stormwater treatment system, you expect that the stormwater treatment system should have much more microplastic than the area that doesn't receive any stormwater. So you should see a big difference. But here, what we see is no difference. So that means stormwater is not the only source of microplastic that ended up in those treatment systems. And so that means it could be air, it could be other things. So to prove that, we take samples from leaves. The idea here is that if air is the medium, the leaves are going to have a lot of microplastics because stormwater is not going to reach there. So what we found over here, as you can see, that those leaves has very high concentration of microplastics. And because stormwater is not the reason why they ended up there, it means that the microplastics over there is because of wind. So that means these treatment systems are receiving microplastic not just in stormwater; they are also receiving from above the grounds using by winds. So it's a critical point because if stormwater treatment systems would be our treatment goal or is the way to mitigate pollutions of microplastic, you are going to solve only half of the problems, or at least part of the problem, because that will not prevent dispersion or exposure of microplastic by wind or air. So that's the critical point. So we know that the source pathways has to account for both stormwater as well as wind as a driver. And second thing, the question that we ask is how much of those microplastics are potential danger for groundwater? So we took the concentration of microplastic at different depth at that one spot, as I said. So as you can see over here on the left side, that's the distribution of concentration at different depth, on depth at 0 to 22 centimeters. So as you see, the very surface sample, so the top surface sample has very highest concentration of higher concentration of microplastics. As you go down towards 5 centimeter depth, it's already very small. And it's going further down, is decreasing very quickly till nearly zero. So what it means that the concentrations are most of the microplastics accumulate within the top 5 centimeters of the soil or the filter media. And it rapidly decreases by exponential way. And if you fit the mean value, the exponential model, the linear, it's in the linear scale or semi-log scale, you'll get the retardation factor or K value. And in this particular case, K is 0.13. So that means that's how fast the retardations takes place. And so by using the exponential model, it allows us to compare at different sites. So the first take-home message here is that stormwater treatment systems are designed well to remove microplastics, and it's not unexpected because they should remove any particles more than 10 microns. That's why the sediments and bacteria are also removed. So that means the microplastic will be removed. And the fact that the concentration is very low, or nearly zero, near 20 centimeter, that means they are most of them will filter out. And now what we did is we compare those K value retardation factor based on different locations or land use. It turns out, in all the places, the retardation is within that 0 to -0.2, and there is no statistical difference between the different spots. So that means irrespective of land use type, stormwater treatment systems, we are going to remove it, and there is no difference in retardation at least. And the last thing we found is that the concentrations is also decreasing. The K value or the retardation factor is changing with the particle size. Particle size of the filter media. So if you look at the outside SEM or the outside the boundary, as you increase the particle size in the soil, the retardation factors decreasing, means it's more transport, which is expected. If you have large particles, it is more likely to or less likely to filter a lot of microplastics by straining or physical filtrations, as you see on the right side of the screen. But we should expect the same thing also in stormwater treatment system, but we didn't see that trend. All it means that even at a very low particle size, there are some plastic particles are moving downward faster in the stormwater treatment system. The reason is first is that stormwater treatment system use mostly sand, so that has higher hydraulic conductivity, so that may allow some particles to move faster downward. Or it could be fact that even at the deeper soil or deeper filter layer, there are already plastic in it because they use compost or mulch as amendments, and those are known to have plastics. So either way, it means either these particles or these medias are pre-contaminated, or they are just not. There are some plastics that are moving downward, and it could be both of them. So the main message here, what we learn at the end of the day is that stormwater treatment systems receive a lot of microplastics, and not all of them are coming via stormwater. There are some that are significant portion could be coming from air. So if you wanted to take the total inventory or how much plastic will accumulate in this system for a long time, we have to account for source pathway for both, not just stormwater treatments, not just stormwater. And second, there is less likely for plastic particles to move downward based on the retardations. But if in stormwater treatment system, they may break down over eventually. And there is a reason to believe that the concentration are increasing down in the deeper layer compared to the outside. The reason is because of filtration is not that effective, or there are pre-contaminations. We don't know which one is true, but at least there are more studies need to be done. So what's the reason, and what's the take-home message here? The more study to be done on to understand the fate of the plastic that accumulate in these systems, how quickly they decompose or break down into smaller pieces, because that will decrease their filtration efficiency. And second is how those accumulated plastic is affecting the functions that these treatment systems are designed to solve. So those are the things that we still don't know, and I hope that many of these researchers here would look at some of these questions, and we are ourselves also working on some of them. So with that, I'd like to thank the organizers as well as all the audience for their attentions, and I'll be here to answer any questions. And again, my contact here, email mohanty@ucla.edu. So if you have any questions or comments, you feel free to email me. Thank you.